This is Unexpected with Hannah Love. In this podcast, you will gain a new perspective of how God loves you enough to call you to things that you couldn't have imagined for yourself. Listen, if you're like me, you probably want to find places or people to serve in your community. And if you're really like me, you get totally overwhelmed trying to find the right community to plug into. Well, today I am so happy that I can make that search a little easier for you. Introducing the Christian Appellation Project. There are volunteer opportunities for short-term individuals like cooks, nurses, home repair, crew leaders. There are also options to become one-year volunteers and AmeriCorps members who assist seniors living in isolation, teach preschoolers basic skills to be ready for kindergarten, mentoring and investing in teens, and serving at food pantries to provide nutritious food to individuals and families in need. CAP has one mission, but many ways to serve. Volunteers come from a wide variety of backgrounds with a diverse set of skills. So, if you believe you can make a difference in Appalachia, CAP would love to hear from you. You would join the many volunteers who are committed to serving and building relationships with the community. So, friends, if you want to help build hope, transform lives and share Christ's love through service in Appalachia, I want to encourage you today. This is your chance. Visit christianapp.org/volunteer to learn more. Welcome back. If you made it through last week's episode, we are starting back on part 2 of the story of Esther. So I'm just going to pick up right where we left off. And if you recall, Esther has provided a banquet for evil Haman, who is out to destroy the Jewish community, and the king, whom she is now married to, and she is going to make a request before the king. And so I did leave you a little bit on a cliffhanger. Haman has built a gallows 75 feet high for her uncle Mordecai because he hates him, and his wife is like, yeah, go build him a gallows and we can hang him on it. So that's where we left off. Esther chapter 6. That night, the king couldn't sleep. He ordered the record book, the day-by-day journal of events, to be brought and read to him. They came across the story there about the time that Mordecai had exposed the plot of Bigthana and Teresha, the 2 royal eunuchs who guarded the entrance and who had conspired to assassinate him. The king said, "What great honor was given to Mordecai for this?" "Nothing," replied the king's servants, who were in attendance. "Nothing has been done for him." The king said, "Is there anybody in the court?" Now, Haman had just come into the outer court of the king's palace to talk to the king about hanging Mordecai on the gallows he had built for him. The king's servant said, "Haman is out there, waiting in the court." "Bring him in," said the king. When Haman entered, the king said, "What would be appropriate for the man the king especially wants to honor?" Haman thought to himself, "He must be talking about honoring me. Who else?" So he answered the king, "For the man the king delights to honor, do this. Bring a royal robe that the king has worn and a horse that the king has ridden, one with a royal crown on its head. Then give the robe and the horse to one of the king's most noble princes. Have him robe the man whom the king especially wants to honor. Have the prince lead him on horseback through the city square, proclaiming before him, 'This is what is done for the man whom the king especially wants to honor.' Go and do it," the king said to Haman. "Don't waste another minute. Take the robe and horse and do what you have proposed to Mordecai the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Don't leave out a single detail of your plan." So Haman took the robe and horse. He robed Mordecai and led him through the city square, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man whom the king especially wants to honor." Then Mordecai returned to the king's gate. But Haman fled to his house, thoroughly mortified, hiding his face. When Haman had finished telling his wife Zeresh and all his friends everything that had happened, his knowledgeable friends who were there and his wife said, "If this Mordecai is in fact a Jew, your bad luck has only begun. You don't stand a chance against him. You're as good as ruined." While they were still talking, the king's eunuchs arrived and hurried Haman off to the dinner that Esther had prepared. So the king and Haman went to dinner with Queen Esther. At this second dinner, while they were drinking wine, the king asked, "Queen Esther, what would you like? Half of my kingdom, just ask, and it's yours." Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor in your eyes, O king, and if it pleases the king, give me my life and give my people their lives. We have been sold, I and my people, to be destroyed, sold to be massacred, eliminated. If we had just been sold off into slavery, I wouldn't even have brought it up. Our troubles wouldn't have been worth bothering the king over." King Xerxes exploded. "Who? Where is he? This is monstrous." "An enemy, an adversary, this evil Haman," said Esther. Haman was terror-stricken before the king and queen. The king, raging, left his wine and stalked out into the palace garden. Haman stood there pleading with Queen Esther for his life. He could see that the king was finished with him and that he was doomed. As the king came back from the garden palace into the banquet hall, Haman was groveling at the couch on which Esther reclined. The king roared out, "Will he even molest the queen while I'm just around the corner?" When the word left the king's mouth, all the blood drained from Haman's face. Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, spoke up. "Look over there. There's the gallows that Haman had built for Mordecai, who saved the king's life. It's right next to Haman's house, 75 feet high." The king said, "Hang him on it." So Haman was hanged on the very gallows that he built for Mordecai, and the king's hot anger cooled. That same day, King Xerxes gave Queen Esther the estate of Haman, arch enemy of the Jews, and Mordecai came before the king because Esther had explained their relationship. The king took off his signet ring, which he had taken back from Haman, and gave it to Mordecai. Esther appointed Mordecai over Haman's estate. Then Esther again spoke to the king, falling at his feet, begging with tears to counter the evil of Haman the Agagite and revoke the plan that he had plotted against the Jews. The king extended his golden scepter to Esther. She got to her feet and stood before the king. She said, "If it please the king and he regards me with favor and thinks this is right, and if he has any affection for me at all, let an order be written that cancels the bulletins authorizing the plan of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agathite, to annihilate the Jews in all the king's provinces. How can I stand to see this catastrophe wipe out my people? How can I bear to stand by and watch the massacre of my own relatives?" King Xerxes said to Queen Esther and Mordecai the Jew, "I've given Haman's estate to Esther, and he's been hanged on the gallows because he attacked the Jews. So go ahead now and write whatever you decide on behalf of the Jews. Then seal it with a signet ring. An order written in the king's name and sealed with his signet ring is irrevocable." So the king's secretaries were brought in, and on the 23rd day of the month of Sivan, the order regarding the Jews was written word for word as Mordecai dictated, and was addressed to the satraps, governors, and officials of the provinces from India to Ethiopia, 127 provinces in all. To each province in its own script and each people in their own language, including the Jews in their script and language. He wrote under the name of King Xerxes and sealed the order with a royal signet ring. He sent out the bulletins by couriers on horseback, riding the fastest royal steeds bred from the royal stud. The king's orders authorized the Jews in every city to arm and defend themselves to the death, killing anyone who threatened them or their women and children, and confiscating for themselves anything owned by their enemies. The day set for all this in all King Xerxes' provinces was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar. The order was posted in public places in each province so everyone could read it, authorizing the Jews to be prepared on that day to avenge themselves on their enemies. The couriers, fired up by the king's order, raced off on the royal horses. At the same time, the order was posted in the palace complex of Susa. Mordecai walked out of the king's presence wearing a royal robe of violet and white, a huge gold crown, and a purple cape of fine linen. The city of Susa exploded with joy. For Jews, it was all sunshine and laughter. They celebrated. They were honored. It was that way all over the country, in every province, every city when the king's bulletin was posted. The Jews took to the streets in celebration, cheering and feasting. Not only that, but many non-Jews became Jews. Now it was dangerous not to be a Jew. On the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, the king's order came into effect. This was the very day that the enemies of the Jews had planned to overpower them. But the tables were now turned. The Jews overpowered those who hated them. The Jews had gathered in the cities throughout King Xerxes' provinces to lay hands on those who were seeking their ruin. Not one man was able to stand up against them. Fear made cowards of them all. What's more, all of the governmental officials, satraps, governors, everyone who worked for the king actually helped the Jews because of Mordecai. They were afraid of him. Mordecai by now was a power in the palace. As Mordecai became more and more powerful, his reputation had grown in all provinces. So the Jews finished off all their enemies with the sword, slaughtering them all left and right, and did as they pleased to those who hated them. In the palace complex of Susa, the Jews massacred 500 men. They also killed the 10 sons of Haman, son of Hammedatha, the arch-enemy of the Jews. The sons were Parshidatha, Aspatha, Adalia, Parmashta, Ariadi, Dalphon, Poratha, Aridatha, Arisai, and Vizatha. But they took no plunder. That day, when it was all over, the number of those killed in the palace complex were given to the king. The king told Queen Esther, "In the palace complex alone, here in Susa, the Jews have killed 500 men, plus Haman's 10 sons. Think of the killing that must have been done to the rest of the provinces. What else do you want? Name it, and it's yours. Your wish is my command." "If it please the king," Queen Esther responded, "give the Jews of Susa permission to extend the terms of the order another day, and have the bodies of Haman's 10 sons hanged in public on the gallows." The king commanded it. The order was extended. The bodies of Haman's 10 sons were publicly hanged. The Jews in Susa went at it again. On the 14th day of Adar, they killed another 300 men in Susa, but again they took no plunder. Meanwhile, in the rest of the king's provinces, the Jews had organized and defended themselves, freeing themselves from oppression. On the 13th day of the month of Adar, they killed 75,000 of those who hated them, but did not take any plunder. The next day, the 14th, they took it easy and celebrated with much food and laughter. But in Susa, since the Jews had banded together on both the 13th and the 14th days, they made the 15th their holiday for laughing and feasting. This accounts for why Jews living out in the country in the royal villages remember the 14th day of Adar for celebration, their day for parties and the exchange of gifts. Mordecai wrote all of this down and sent copies to all the Jews in all King Xerxes' provinces, regardless of distance, calling for an annual celebration on the 14th and 15th days of Adar as the occasion, when Jews got relief from their enemies, the month in which their sorrow turned to joy. Mourning somersaulted into a holiday for parties and fun and laughter, the sending and receiving of presents and the giving gifts to the poor. And they did it. What started then became a tradition, continuing the practice of what Mordecai had written to them. Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agathite, the arch-enemy of all Jews, had schemed to destroy all Jews. He had cast the lot to throw them into a panic and destroy them. But when Queen Esther intervened with the king, he gave written orders what the evil scheme that Haman had worked out should boomerang back on his own head. He and his sons were hanged on the gallows. That's why these days are called Purim, for the word pur or lot. Therefore, because of everything written in this letter, and because of all that they have been through, the Jews agreed to continue. It became a tradition for them, their children, and all future converts to remember these 2 days every year on the specific dates set down in the letter. These days are to be remembered and kept by every single generation, every last family, every province and city. These days of Purim have never been neglected among the Jews. The memory of them must never die out among their descendants. Queen Esther, the daughter of Abihail, backed Mordecai the Jew, using her full queenly authority in the second Purim letter to endorse and ratify what he wrote. Calming and reassuring letters went out to all the Jews throughout 127 provinces of Xerxes' kingdom to fix these days of Purim, their assigned place on the calendar, dates set by Mordecai the Jew, what they had agreed to for themselves and their descendants regarding their fasting and mourning. Esther's word confirmed the tradition of Purim and was written in the book. King Xerxes imposed taxes from one end of his empire to the other. For the rest of it, King Xerxes' extensive accomplishments, along with a detailed account of the brilliant Mordecai, whom the king had promoted, that is all written in the Chronicles of the Kings of Media and Persia. Mordecai the Jew ranked second in command to King Xerxes. He was popular among the Jews and greatly respected by them. He worked hard for the good of his people. He cared for the peace and prosperity of his race. So there you have it, folks. That is the end of the story of Esther. It's a story that is so easy to fall in love with. It sounds like it's straight out of the script of a blockbuster movie. It has, in fact, been turned into a movie various times and variations through the years. And if you're a reader like me, you may even be interested in the historical fiction version that paints even more in depth of a picture of Esther's life. It fills in historical facts with fictional possibilities of what she might have experienced throughout her journey to queen, and a voice for her people. Regardless of how in-depth you want to go with this story, I can't go without acknowledging that it really happened. And to this day, the Jewish people still celebrate the holiday of Purim. Now, aside from this excitement that the story elicits, I also want to pull out some thoughts and maybe even a few lessons too. At first read, the entire story sounds like a fairy tale. Esther, a young, beautiful orphan, becomes the queen of the Persian Empire. But let's take a deeper look. If we rewind a little, we will see that this story actually picks up right after the destruction of Jerusalem. Babylon captured many Jews and took them to be slaves in exile. And at this point, the Jewish people assimilated to the new land. And though they were given the opportunity to return to their country of origin, many didn't because it was war-torn and in ruins. Now, I say all of this to note that Esther was not just an orphan, but she was a foreigner too. Then they sent out an edict to gather the young virgins around the land for the king to choose from. So it's not exactly the most romantic way to find a new wife. The inference here is that Esther likely didn't choose to go and was possibly even taken against her will. She may have even been taken away from the only family that she knew, and likely from friends and a community. From this point, she was groomed and prepared for meeting with the king. And after a year of preparation away from her loved ones, she would spend one night with the king. If he chose her, she would become queen. But if he sent her away, she would spend the rest of her life as a concubine in the king's palace, unable to marry any other man, and beneath the title of one of the wives of the king. A lonely life. He did, however, choose her, though I do wonder if this newfound life as queen was any less lonely than the alternative. She likely had many jealous women around, and as noted in chapter 4, she likely had very little interaction with the king, if any, outside of his own inquiry. But there was a reason. There was a reason for her rise to position. There was a reason her ethnicity had been kept successfully as a secret. There was a reason, and it was her time to step into it. As declared by Mordecai, perhaps she had come to her royal position for such a time as this. And so, sweet friends, today, if you're listening to this story of Esther, whether you found it an exciting story and you just thought it was entertaining, or whether something in it resonated with you, if you have felt that you were in a season of loneliness, a season of separation from loved ones, a season of preparation for something that you didn't know was ahead of you, but you sensed that there was more, just remember that many times, for such a time as this, God has prepared you. For such a time as this, God has called you to step into a position of taking a risk. I mean, it may not be as dramatic as stepping into the presence of the king and possibly being executed because you weren't invited there, but maybe it looks like stepping into a position that could end you socially, or stepping into a position that could be the death of an old life, and now you are stepping into a new one because you know that God has called you into obedience. And if this is speaking to you today, I am just praying over you, sweet friends, that you have the boldness to say yes, that you have the boldness and the courage to step into whatever place God is calling you to for such a time as this. Because many times there are seasons of preparation that God will send for you in isolation to prepare you for the seasons ahead. So today I am praying for the boldness to step in, for the courage to say yes, and for the discernment to make wise decisions as you go on into your future. Perhaps you will encourage a generation ahead of you, and perhaps you will lay the foundations for them, like Esther laid the foundations for her people, rescuing them from death and launching them into a new season of celebration and life. Thank you so much for listening today. If this episode has encouraged you, please feel free to share it with your family and friends. There's a lot of stuff going on in the world today, and my hope is that this show is a candle in the dark.